The National Committee has been one of the leading organizations in building positive relations between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, facilitating constructive dialogue and encouraging the exchange of American and Chinese ideas and culture. Of course, the U.S. China relationship is one of great significance to President Carter as well. As you all know, he played a unique role in laying the foundation for the current relationship by normalizing diplomatic relations 35 years ago.
The Republic of China was born on my 25th birthday, October the 1st, 1979. And I've been interested in China, obviously, ever since then. I was very, 1949. I was very interested in seeing...
It looked like it was 79.
Well, it does. I was thinking about 79. Anyway, I was very interested also in when Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, and he and the Chinese officials declared there was only one president.
Well, you don't need to remain in your seats, but I want you to realize that there's a nice segue here between his remarks ending on the need to establish some relationships with the climate change in China and the U.S. and China, because our follow-up speaker will be introduced has worked for the past 15 years on those kinds of issues in China. So she'll have a lot to say for you to listen to. I want to be sure to welcome, there's a contingency here from Northern State University that we would like to welcome because they are in the process of trying to get a Confucius Institute there at Northern. So we welcome them. We're just going to wave your hands a little bit to these people who are coming there. And there's also a gentleman from the Governor's Office of Economic Development, an international trade specialist, Brian Budmeier. He had some issues in Sioux Falls, but was going to try to get here to hear Dr. Boyle's remarks. So go help yourself to some refreshments, but then come back in because we've got some more exciting things for you to hear. Harriet Sweetman was the founding director of the South Dakota World Affairs Council. And I've asked her to introduce Christine Boyle, our follow-up speaker, because Harriet also spent time in China and has a great love for and appreciation of China and all things with that. So if you would just draw your attention to Harriet, who will introduce Christine.
Number one, I'm going to keep my introduction very short because we have a fabulous speaker and it will be much more interesting to listen to her than it is to me. But first I thought, when I heard that we were going to have a speaker whose expertise included water as one of the focal points, my memory of being in China was suffering from a water shortage when we lived in a city of probably 2 million people and had absolutely no water available for several days in a row. And you wondered what's going to happen. Fortunately, it rained, the water pressure came up, we could get water in our apartment, we survived, and went on. But having said that, we experienced that in addition to boiling water for safe drinking. And that made me very aware of what it means when water becomes a major commodity that is no longer there to sustain life, let alone to sustain the growth of plants and other animals. How many of you have been in China? I probably see a pretty big show of hands. How many of you are dealing intellectually or as faculty or students with issues connected with water and all the things that are related to that? I think there will be a pretty good show of hands here too. Yeah, right. So Christine, you have people that have background in interest as well as an audience that wants to learn from your expertise. The person who is our speaker today is way too young to know all that she does. But let me give you a bit about her background and then I will let her speak. She has a degree in Chinese from Columbia University, her first degree. She also has an undergraduate bachelor's degree from attended bachelor's degree from the University of Washington because she transitioned from being an expert linguist to being interested in all of the ecological and technical issues that are now her area of expertise. So she has essentially a double plan. In all of this, she moved into the consulting area and now heads a company called Blue Horizon Insight. I recommend that you look at her website. It's beautiful, and it will give you far more detail about what she actually does than I want to try to do now, because I want to introduce Christine and let her talk. So, Christine Boyle.
Now I understand what it's like to have a tail, because I have this little tail that comes with me. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay. A little more. Well, first, I am so excited to be here, and I have been welcomed so graciously by the South Dakota World Affairs Council and Jeannie and her team, by Harriet today, who I spent the day with and saw your art, some photographs, a couple museums, and the town, and it's really lovely and really, really nice to be here. My name is Christine, and my first trip to China was in 1997 as a language student, and I studied then at Beijing University. So I'm curious, of the group here, I just want to get a kind of assortment of who we've got. Who are the students that are here tonight? All right, students. And then kind of like business people who do business people. And then other community members. Okay, wonderful. Well, to my Chinese friends, 大家好. Nice to see you. So I think that a lot of what I talked about, that President Carter talked about, is exactly kind of how I want to start things. I put up this picture of a bridge because I think that there's been no other time in Chinese-U.S. relations than, I could say any time over the past few years, but then right now that's as important to build bridges. I became a language student and became interested in China because I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and I just had this burning curiosity, this country on the other side that I only saw on TV, where I knew from watching television that there were 1 billion people that lived there, and I just thought, 1 billion people, and like, who are these people? What's going on over there? We saw all these images that seemed so foreign, and the language that seemed so foreign, and that really inspired me as a teenager to start studying Chinese, and so that's what I did. And then after that, once I had been to China and kind of understood more about what an amazing country it was then that I decided that I wanted to continue working in China. And at that point, I took a long and windy road, but started studying water resource planning, and went back to China in 2004 as a researcher, and then have been working in China ever since. And many of these, to the students in the room, I did many different government-funded programs. I was a National Science Fellow, Summer Scholar, Academy of Science Summer Scholar, Fulbright Scholar. So there's so many opportunities to be had if you can find those grants and work with your student leaders and university leaders to really kind of engage. I think President Carter, it was interesting to me that he talked about that the presidents are really leading setting the tone. From my experience, I say, well, of course he's going to say that he's a president, right? But from my experience, there's so much kind of different exchanges in bridge building for language exchanges and academic exchanges and cultural exchanges and business exchanges, and that all of us in this room can do that. We don't have to wait for our president to do the work. There's a lot of work that can be done in this room right here. And our little friend in the back, he can be our first little ambassador. That's so cute. So I kind of want to set the scene with a few photos that to really talk about the dramatic change that's happened in China and kind of set the stage here. This is Shanghai in 2012. This is Shanghai in 1990. So we've got, that's 22 years. And, and that all happened in 22 years. This is Shenzhen in 2012. Shenzhen, anyone know where Shenzhen is? Everybody knows. Yell it out. Where is it? South, right? Near Hong Kong. That's right. You can actually walk across from Shenzhen. You can walk over to Hong Kong. So here's Shenzhen in 2012. Here's Shenzhen in 1980. My dissertation advisor is from Shenzhen, so she's telling me growing up, she grew up in a fishing village, right? So, I mean, this is just, imagine like the concrete, the steel, the electricity, the commerce, like just that could even possibly give you an understanding of this shift. And a lot of what we're talking about is both urbanization and economic development. A few stats that 19% of China's population lived in cities in 1980, and 53% live in cities in 2013. And that, we're talking with a population of 1.3 billion, that's an incredibly huge shift. Something that Chinese are very proud of and that I'm proud of for the nation is also their economic development. A stat from the World Bank is that between 1981 and 2010, the country of China, the Chinese government, pulled 680 million people out of abject poverty. That is a feat that has really never been done before, or done before nor since, in terms of sort of a shift from 84% of people living on $1 a day or less to now less than 10% of the Chinese people living on $1 a day or less. So we can talk a lot about the different challenges in terms of economic development in the country, but these are accomplishments that really can't be denied. So the vantage point that I'm going to talk about today is really about farming. My work in China focused on irrigation, and so that's where we can talk about both water and food security, because my studies there and the work I did were a lot with guys like this, who I like to call Farmer Joe. Farmer Joe, he's been through a lot in his life, and now these days, you can see that he's in the midst of this really extensive irrigation canal system. But really, what farmers of this generation have seen is a whole country that has just transformed while he's trying to, kind of till the land and grow his crops. The amount of economic development and change and cultural shifts and governance have been happening all around him. And the reason I like to talk about Farmer Joe and also to talk about irrigation is that this is a really nice lens to understand both the water side and the food side of China's kind of struggles around both food and water security. So we'll do a little China Water 101. China is a large country and is made up of several rivers. We'll get to dams later, but several large rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. Something that is quite interesting is that we talk a lot about China's water shortages, but something to point out is that Tibet and the Tibetan Plateau are actually house a huge amount of the world's water. It's actually the starting point for many of the world's largest river basins, including the Mekong, the Ganges that flows into India. And so there is a huge amount of water. It's just that when we talk about water, what's even more interesting is that water is difficult to transport, and you need to have the water where the people are in the land, and this is not happening in China. We also can note that a lot of these major rivers that originate in China flow across national borders into Southeast Asia, into South Asia. And so what happens in China doesn't just affect the Chinese, it also affects people throughout Asia. And this has become quite controversial. So let's jump into a little bit about water and farming. What we see in China, the most extreme water scarcity are the red areas, and the biggest circles on the map are the main areas of farming and sown land. So what we see and what we could call this is a large mismatch in terms of where the land is for farming and also where the water is. Northern China, which is where I've done a lot of my work, accounts for only 19% of China's water, but almost 50% of China's population is in the north. And it's also the nation's main wheat and corn belt. So we see that almost 65% of China's arable land is in the north. and yet this is also the place where there's extreme water scarcity and a lot of economic development for that matter. So there's a huge amount of pressure on systems in the north that are right now kind of coming to a head as we see how these water shortages are affecting both agriculture and economic development. And a lot of this relates to energy development too. So this is a projection here that was done by the World Bank that was looking to see what was going to be the gap between water supply and demand by 2030. And if we look here on the dark blue in the map, we see that very large river basins in China will experience a gap in between the water supply, which is how much water you have, and the demand, which is how much water you need by the year 2030. This is interesting because we're going to get into a little bit into the work that I do with the World Bank, and this does not include climate change. This is just kind of a status quo look at simply economic development pressures on the land and how water, different water needs will be met or not met over the next 15 years. So that is the problem in a nutshell. Pollution is always, we can layer on lots of different issues. Pollution is another large issue that we won't really, I'm not really touching on a lot today, but I think what's more interesting is to talk about kind of the governance and the policy. What is the government doing about this, and what are cities and rural communities doing about it? And my favorite question where we do our audience participation, why are you all here? Why do we, what's in this for you all? Is there and this is where I'm going to stop talking for a second and just simply ask if people could raise their hands and say, why is this interesting, and what are the ties here to your community that would make these issues interesting or compelling or pressing for folks here in Brookings?
I like to eat, and all those people who drive up the price of food.
That's right. Yeah. So that's a great one. This is a price pressure. If there's if there's kind of a constrained amount of food or grain, the price goes up, and we'll talk about that a little more too. That's a good one. Yes, sir.
As natural resources become more scarce, human conflict increases.
That's right. So just kind of these different, these talks about resource wars, water wars, and I don't know enough about what's going on in the Middle East to know how much of it's about resources, but I could see that, yeah, these conflicts are ever looming.
It's water.
It's water. Yeah, it is water. The Middle East. That's what. Yeah, I feel like that's the kind of the, no pun intended, but that's the undercurrent of lots of what's going on there. Oh gosh, all the way in the back here.
Should we limit this water discussion just to the borders of the People's Republic, or should it extend to every part of the world where their use of water influences scarce quality of water elsewhere? For example, the million Chinese in Africa.
Well, what I'm here is to make this conversation meaningful for you. So, so you can tell me. But yeah, I think Africa has a huge amount of challenges, and water is certainly one of them. So, yeah, absolutely.
California has a water.
California. Oh my gosh, I live in California, and the water issues there are so drastic and severe. And it's interesting that I was trained and worked a lot in China because, I'm pretty familiar now and really know about what's going on with things like drought and water conflict and the need for efficiency. And now I'm in California, and I'm like, hey, I'm real popular here all of a sudden. But I think that's another area for kind of policy and cultural and scientific and technological exchange too. Okay, well, this is good, guys. So we're all on the same page. We know this is important, especially if we don't want our dinner ticket price to go up. These are important things. So I'll jump right a little bit back into just sort of framing what's going on in China from the government level. And mostly this, I'm not talking about urban water here. We're mostly going to be talking about rural water and irrigation. So since something happened in, I'm forgetting all my stats now, but in the late to mid 80s, I think it was 1987, 1988, what happened during that time was that the Yellow River, which is the main river in the north, for the first time in modern history, did not reach the Bohai Sea. And that this had a kind of a trickle effect on agricultural communities in the area and ended up leading to large economic losses. And this really became a turning point in terms of Chinese water law. And we saw that after that point that water was really more on the agenda of the Chinese government. There were a series of water laws passed, the first in 1988, another one in 2002. And 7 river basin commissions were formed, and a number of other policy, kind of high-level policy regulations were put in place. But in the end, we saw that almost zero effect on agricultural water use efficiency. Like, no matter what was going on from the top level, that all these laws didn't really seem to be making a dribble of difference in terms of how Farmer Joe and his buddies and all his farming colleagues, which are roughly 200 million of them, were using water in the countryside. It was kind of a very top-down approach and had very little impact as to the water use efficiency levels. So China, just to put it in relative comparison, has we call water use efficiency level of 0.45 or 0.50, which means that about half of the water that from the main stem, from the water source, is ever reaching the land. I don't know, does anyone here know what the water use efficiency level is in South Dakota? Wrong crowd. I would guess that it would probably be, like, I think Israel, which is a very efficient place, has a water use efficiency of, I would say, like 0.8 or 0.85. And I would guess that farms around here would probably be like 0.65 or 0.70, something like that. So very much more efficient in terms of how that water is being used. So the government put a lot of money and kind of talk into making these changes. But what we saw was that there's a very complicated bureaucracy here, and that both land and water were being controlled. They had to go through all these different levels. So the state council makes a law, the water law, and then it gets all these different proclamations get kind of pushed down through these different bureaucratic levels. And when it got to the township and the village, there was very little there in terms of investment money or the kind of teeth through which that any of these laws could be enforced. So in the end, really, nothing changed. And then 2011 came along, and 2011 was a very interesting year. 2011 was a benchmark year for water conservation. It was a year when the 12th 5-year plan, the 12th 5-year plan, and the #1 policy document, these are two large planning strategic documents that had always been focused on, no shock here, economic development. We need to make money, make more money, growth, all these things. It was the first year that these big policy plans really took a focus on water. And this was because the situation, especially in the north, was getting very serious. There were rampant pollution, rampant kind of food crises, and other things, driving of prices due to a few key droughts. And that this was a year that the Chinese government finally decided to really take water more seriously. And it has been effective. There has been progress since that time. Hold on, getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so another thing that happened besides policy is engineering. Does anyone know what this picture is from? No, not the dam. That's a good start though. It's a mega project. Sure. That's right. This is the south to north water transfer project. And these are some huge pipes that will ultimately divert 45 billion cubic meters of water per year from the Yangtze River into various places in various basins in northern China, very dry, thirsty northern China. So if we could talk about this in terms of, there's so many things to talk about with this. 23 pumping stations, huge amount of energy, concrete, displaced people a price tag of $62 billion to pump this water. Now, if I were to kind of put this in comparison, I would say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder where the Chinese figured out how to do that. California. California has huge water, interbasin water transfers too. We pump water from Lake Shasta in the north all the way down to Los Angeles and all throughout the state. And there's a huge new legislation that's probably going to be passed this called the Bay Delta Plan that it's called the Bay Delta Pipeline, and it has a price tag of $14 billion as well. So, I think there's been a lot of criticism of this plan, and I agree with a lot of it. I don't think that these huge interbasin transfers should be done unless there's a lot of work also being done on efficiency and using water wisely before you start just pumping water all around. But on the other hand, who am I to say, because I live in California and we do the same thing, that Los Angeles we know wouldn't really exist as we knew it today if this wasn't happening in our own country. So this is happening in China. The eastern route is done. The middle route is, the central route is well on its way, and the western route is, I don't know if they've broken ground on that or not. I really don't know, if you all know. But this water is going to feed the cities. This isn't water that's going to be diverted for China's irrigation. This is water that's going to feed China's thirsty cities like Beijing and Tianjin and several of the major northern cities. So kind of just running through these different reforms, I did a lot of work for some different investment groups looking at food policy reform and how water and water shortages are impacting China's food production. So one thing I thought would be really interesting for folks here was to look at what we called virtual water trade strategy. And these are China's agricultural imports. I know that this region is a huge soybean producer and corn producer. And we see that indeed there has been some spikes and real changes, especially around the import of fruits and veggies in China. And we'll get to later what this doesn't show well that I think is underrepresented is the import of feedstock. And we can talk about that later too, but we see that although China does have what's called like a food self-sufficiency target of 95%, that indeed that because of the rising demand for food and also the rising demand for feedstock, that they are importing more and more and have a real overseas strategy in terms of how they're going to meet the demand for food and keep it affordable, which is everyone's concern. So this was, and the group I worked for this was like a hedge fund investment banking group because they have a lot of, Tropicana has huge holdings there, Lay's potato chips. There's a lot of large Fortune 500 companies that have a lot of agricultural investments in China, and they're very concerned about the water question. So this also is kind of a driver of a lot of these, is the rising appetite for meat in China. It's moved with economic development. We've seen a transition from a large reliance on kind of tofu and vegetables and rice to a much more heavy appetite for meat. So we see that grain production is increasing and that meat production is also increasing to keep up with the kind of the demands of folks in the cities, especially who have enough food or enough money to buy a nice Peking duck or a nice steak if they want to. And this is posing a real challenge because it's not simply that we don't know where this will tail off. That the rising appetite for meat is really driving really kind of global agricultural commodity markets in a really fast-paced way. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm just going to hit all the big points, and we can talk about any of these more. But next, I want to talk about climate change. My firm was commissioned with a team at the World Bank to look at how climate change is going to impact water supply and food production in China over the next 30 years. So we did a basin-by-basin analysis and found that it's quite serious what's going to happen with climate change. The interesting finding of that report actually was that although climate change is important, the sheer economic development trajectory of China will be much more influential on shifts in water and food supply than anything about climate change. So that was interesting. But we located these 4 key basins, which we found as is interesting that these were going to have particularly dramatic effects due to climate change, and mostly with decreased runoff from the river, which is going to impact irrigation scheduling, crop production, food, and we'll get into a little bit more about what that looks like. We also measured these supply deficits in these different basins. So what A1, A2, and B2 mean those are the different climate scenarios. So they have to do with the severity of what the projected climate change impacts would be like. But what we really found is that water scarcity was going to intensify in every basin, and that like the previous report that was done, that there will be a gap, and that it's unclear right now how the nation will go about meeting this gap. Now, if you have a gap, we have gaps in California, there are 2 ways to meet a gap. Either you can increase supply, which is very expensive. Either you build large engineering projects, or you desalinate the ocean, however you, I don't know, create water. But what you can also do is you can actually just use water more efficiently. You can conserve and use water in a more effective way so that your actual demand for water goes down and you don't have to do so much investment in supply. This one I brought in just because I thought you guys might be the right crowd for it. This is really hard to see, and I apologize for that. But what we did here is we looked at these 4 different commodities, agricultural commodities, and looked at each river basin to see how climate change was going to impact production of these particular commodities. And I think on the lower left that the soybean one might be interesting to you all in the key crop growing areas for soybeans, that the soybean production within China itself was going to continue to decrease due to climate change. We could see that soybeans might be grown another place, and we see that there's shifts in terms of where you're going to grow different crops due to changes in both land use and with climate change. But in the key growing areas, that soybean production was going to decrease. And this is all of these are important for food security, land planning, a whole different things. So, and I hate to tell my friend in the front here, but my second point is going to be about increasing prices of food. So just a few take-home points about all of this is that one is that the rapid pace of economic development is really is what's stressing China's resources in terms of land and water, and that even if climate change, we would call northern China in particular a place that lives on its water margin, that it's very close to not having enough water due to a drought or whatever, and that when you have this rapid economic development and all these development pressures, that's when disaster can strike, because something like climate change or an extreme drought can kind of lead it over its tipping point and really lead to some kind of like water rationing and water shortages that can be quite devastating, especially for agricultural communities. We also saw that with the decreased production due to climate change, that this indeed was going to drive up prices of food. So that's not good. That's not good news for anyone in the world, and that this is something that's of great concern. That China will continue to import more agricultural commodities and export less to the global market, and that China's grain self-sufficiency levels will be lowered. Right now they target 95% sufficiency to grow their own grain for their own people, and that this is going to become increasingly difficult for the nation to meet these targets due to both changing land patterns and also to water shortages. So I don't know if we think this is good news or bad news. Probably not great news, but what you can say is that there are a lot of management, governance, technology solutions that can help kind of temper the impact of each of these. There's a lot of room for both technology in terms of agricultural equipment, in terms of seeds, in terms of fertilizer and management decisions that if these are done in modernizing China's agricultural sector, that it's not such a doom and gloom situation, that there's a lot of room for improvements and modernization in the sector that that I think will be with universities like SDSU and other land-grant universities, that there's a lot of room for exchange and improvement. So those are my remarks for today. I am always available. I am quite an entrepreneur. I run 2 firms, a consulting firm and a software firm in San Francisco. So I'm busy doing all these things, but I'm always kind of excited to talk with people and learn more about how these issues affect you. So I wonder if we might want to just open it up for a few minutes of conversation, if anyone had any questions. Sure.
How do the Chinese prioritize water usage? To see an example I'm talking about. Yeah. There's a court case called Nebraska versus Colorado, where Denver wanted to dam up the South Platte River in order to have water, and Nebraska's farmers won because they were first in time, first in right.
Yeah. Historically, agriculture had dibs on water. These days, it's often that the urban sector is getting more dibs on water, but it's also like between provinces, there's actual negotiations that happen all the time. So, and even we see this in the village level too, like between Gansu and Ningxia, 2 provinces, they might, that region is going to get a certain allocation, but they'll meet that year and say, hey, you got this much last year, you need this much next year. So it's more of kind of not a top-down decision, but it'll be more of a kind of a province-to-province negotiation at times. So there's no policy like the one you're saying about, it's not a legalistic kind of decision. It's more of a negotiation. I saw something really interesting in the villages. Like in the villages, everyone is has a certain place on the canal. Like this year, there might be, let's say there's 25 farms in the village, that every year you get a number, right? Like first year you're number 1, then you're the second one that gets water, the third. Well, if you're the 25th, it's pretty likely that you're not going to get any water. And so if you're 25th in one year, the next year you move up to number 1. And then the village people will actually help you if you're number 25. Like you might have raised a pig that year, and you might kill your pig so that you can make money that way, so you don't have to work your land. And there's a lot of kind of negotiation and little systems that I saw about how people would decide who got water, because it was always a concern.
In the southwest part of the United States, it's more of a sharing water culture than the rest of the United States. And that's, as I understand, comes from the fact that the Spanish settled that, and the Moors had influenced Spanish water policy. The cultural attitude towards water that I understand from North Africa and the Middle East is that you share water. Is that the same thing you're talking about here?
No, it wasn't that. It was more like that. It wasn't like that. It was like we should be fair, and that if you get water this year, I'm going to get the water next year. And that it wasn't like, oh, let's just share, but it was much more like, let's make a system so that we know every year if we're going to get water, who's going to get water, and that you can do some planning so that you could have enough, which is interesting.
So another example is of the local people trying to figure out how to work within the system that's given to them.
That's right. That's right.
And you talked about it was not so much top-down between provinces, but if we talk about at the local level, at the village level, and if we want to talk, we know that more sustainable changes do take place when the ideas come up out of the people, so bottom-up approach to development, community development, economic development. So from what you know and your observation and work in the villages, how would you describe efforts, activities that are from the bottom up, where the people are saying, okay, these are some ideas that would work maybe amongst us, and start to diffuse some pretty significant changes related to water and scarcity of water?
Well, it's so funny you ask, because that's what my dissertation was about. But I won't go into all that. But it was funny because my committee at the University of North Carolina had really read, Eleanor Ostrom and all this work about common pool resources, and was like, oh, this is like a grassroots thing. Everyone is going to be so sustainable. A lot of those things didn't really apply in China, and there are a number of reasons. One was that the villages had always been very kind of like told what to do. Like the leaders would come and say, you get this much water, you get to plant this much land. And there was a real kind of like, a bit of an attitude of kind of like waiting to hear what we should do. And there wasn't that initiative of like, always of like, okay, especially when it came to water. There are other things that were done on a very cooperative level. There's a lot of like really nice cooperation happening in the farms. But on the other hand, some of it was like, okay, we would go in, there's like all this, like some of those pictures, like there's just like a whole canal full of garbage. You're like, how is all the water supposed to go into this canal and feed your land if it's full of garbage? They're like, well, we're waiting for the government to come and help us clean out the garbage. So it was like, well, but how are you, I mean, you've got people here. Like, why don't you just clean out the garbage? They're like, no, we don't want to do that. Like, so there wasn't always that. There was some blockages in terms of, they thought if it looked crappy enough that the government might give them a new canal, or, you know, that something might happen. So it wasn't, we always were kind of like looking for those things. But what we have seen is that, on the other hand, you know, there is a lot of scarcity happening in terms of like figuring out these systems to share and have equitable distribution, that we did see that happening. But there's a lot of really poorly kept infrastructure that could have been done better if people had kind of had some kind of incentive to work together and dig out the canal or clean up the garbage, and it just wasn't happening.
And just to add to that, I think it's important to understand it's not that they were lazy or unwilling to help. It's my experience in Ukraine just after it became independent is that it was a mindset of the role of the people versus the role of the government. It's so true. It's a leadership change of ways of thinking. It's not an issue of laziness.
It's not. It's just like it wasn't clear to them that that was their job.
Hard for us to understand.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. Yeah, I agree. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that in China, the water efficiency is very low.
Yeah.
Two questions related to that. First of all, how to define this water efficiency? That's number one. Number two, do you know what's the reason to cause that low water usage efficiency?
So efficiency, it can be defined in a number of different ways. The way that I use to define it is the portion of water that reaches the field from the source. So say it's 0.50, it means that only half of the water made it from the source to the field. And there are other ways, I'm sure that agronomists use, that's the one that we use a lot. And that's the number 0.45 and 0.50 are the numbers that have been quoted a lot in the different documents. I think that in terms of, your second question is really about kind of modernization and like why is so few people using like drip irrigation or these different types of burrowing systems or these different systems that we've seen can increase or keep your yields the same and use so much less water. A lot of it is simply about education and training, and that, you know, it's a very old, the farmers are really old, and there hasn't been very much training to be done to go in and say, here's what you should do, here's why you should do it. So it's the sort of, you know, in the US we have the agricultural extension model, and that really dissipated in China in the 90s and into the 2000s. So there just isn't that education and support that is needed to help folks in these tiny little farmers and farms understand how to use water in a more efficient way. We would call it like water-saving technology. Like these water-saving technologies are available, they're affordable, but they're just not being utilized.
So do you know whether there's really awareness and also implementation by the Chinese government?
They're trying, man. Yeah. I think that now what they're trying to do a lot more of these agricultural extension type of efforts and put more training and leadership and into rural communities so that someone is going to come into your village and help train you on how to do this. It also is, there's also a lot of these water user associations that are being created so that farmers get more access to capital and education about how to do these types of things. There's also a lot of land consolidation going on and trying to modernize land so it's not all these tiny little farms. And when you have consolidation, you often will have a lot of efficiency upgrades too. So that's a whole different, if we want to talk about land consolidation and land reform, we'll come back and do that next time. Yeah.
What are the factors that influence efficiency? Is it evaporation and absorption?
A lot of it is application method. I mean, so, gosh, I wish I had my full deck of photos. Like, so the water comes in through a canal, and how the water gets onto your farm is that you open up the sluice gate, and all the water just floods in. So if you don't have your sluice gate open, you're not going to get your water. But what do you do? How else? Like, kind of, there's no like holding tank or a hose or a drip system that can elevate the water and then use gravity to like pump it in. So a lot of it is just the way that it's coming into your field. There weren't a lot of options besides flood irrigation, and things like this, that they need kind of like whole systems to really modernize so that you could have some kind of holding tank so that you could use sprinklers and take advantage of gravity and things like that. There's pretty old-fashioned systems. But they're not doing as much flood irrigation in rice paddies in northern China now, which is, thank goodness.
Yes, sir.
What's the percentage of Chinese agriculture that's under irrigation now?
Oh, I think, that's a good question. I have that. I'm like, all the stats I have. I would guess it's probably around, so in China, 70% of water is used for agriculture, and 30% is used for industrial and municipal. So of that 70%, well, that's all used for irrigation, really. But between irrigation and rain-fed, I would guess 60 or 70% is irrigated. Like the rain-fed agriculture is primarily in the south, and it's certainly not the majority of the farmlands. Irrigation is increasing? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And but they're really trying to make it more efficient as they do that, but it's expensive, so.
Your map showed heavy water use areas sort of in the northeast or east central.
Yeah.
But my impression is, and maybe my geography's off here, that the northwest is sort of becoming desert.
The northwest. Yeah, the northwest is quite dry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they doing anything to remedy that?
The desertification? Oh yeah, there's a lot of efforts. There's a lot of the efforts there are around planting trees and trying to. They actually had this interesting program. What was it called? It was called. It was basically a program where the government gave you cash to plant trees because just like where's Harriet? Are you here? Harriet showed me the photo today of South Dakota. The South Dakota before there were trees and when there was all this dust bowl, and and I think that's what would happen. So if you grow the trees, then you have more of the soil kind of being locked down. So they're doing all these different kinds of experiments to pay farmers to give up their land and grow trees. And there are a lot of different efforts to stem desertification to various success rates. So, yes, sir.
When we were in China in 1993, and I think others who have been there, one of the things that always fascinated us was on the evening news when the dignitaries would go to some major meeting and they were all gathering around, they were always planting a tree. That was standard operating procedure.
Just plant a tree.
They would plant a tree.
I like that.
News every single night.
Well, thank you all so much, and it's been a real pleasure. I hope it was. I learned a lot from Jimmy Carter, so I hope we all kind of take home our messages. So thank you all very much.